Hello. Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name's John Minford, and this is my third lecture here. This time, I've got one more next week, and then I'm leaving to go back to France. I just want to say something before this lecture starts. My first lecture, I talked about蒲松龄's what I called his lineage as a writer and his life in the 17th and 18th centuries. And then my second lecture, I was talking about the variety of the Liao Zhai stories. I just wanted to put in front of you a range of different stories to show you how incredibly varied they are. They range from very, very short stories of like half a page to some longer stories of 12, 15 pages long. And I just wanted to give you a taste of that last time. That was before Easter, so probably everyone's forgotten about that by now. Now, since giving that lecture, I've been reading a lot about蒲松龄, and something that interests me greatly is that he wrote a lot of poetry. Not many people know about it. He wrote a lot of shi poetry and also ci poetry. And it's very good poetry. I really like it, and I'm thinking of translating it later in my life, if I'm allowed to. Now, I mention that because today's talk is how we can be helped to understand Mr. Pu's stories by reading the commentators from the 19th century, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But I've also realized that another way of understanding him and his stories is to read his poetry. And I've already found it fascinating to learn about his own life as expressed in his poetry, especially his attitude towards love, because he was very much in love with a young sing-song girl and called Gu Qingxia. And it's a fascinating story because up till now, people knew nothing really about蒲松龄's personal life. They knew he had a very nice wife, who was not at all interested in literature, but she was a very faithful and loyal wife, and he wrote a very beautiful tribute to her when she died, a few years before he died. But otherwise we know very little about his love life, his personal life, his relationships. But really, it's all there in his poetry. And recently, very recently, in the last 10 years, a lot of mainland scholars, such as the famous lady Ma Ruifang in Shandong Daxue, they've been starting to write essays about his poetry and how his poetry tells the story of his love affair with this beautiful young sing-song girl, who was actually someone he met when he was living in the south of China. He only went to the south of China once in his life. But during that time, he obviously met this very beautiful lady and wrote many, many poems about her. And I think that's absolutely fascinating because it gives us a new light on his how he came to write so many stories which are basically about love. And it's not just from his imagination. He also experienced a lot of things himself. And I'm going to be very interested in the next few years. I'm planning to read all his poems and try to translate them. But that's just by the way. Today I'm going to talk about now where's my little gizmo? Hang on. The title of my talk is How to Read the Strange Tales, Liao Zhai de Du Fa, and I've called it Clues from the old 19th century commentators, because although蒲松龄wrote his stories at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, and they were published in the second half of the 18th century, it was really not until the 19th century that people started writing commentaries. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, in Chinese literature, there's a very old tradition of writing commentaries. And it goes way, way back to the beginning of the Chinese literary heritage. In fact, one can even compare it with the Chinese habit of writing tiba, colophons they're called, on paintings. It's symptomatic of a very different attitude towards art and literature. You know, in the West, literature and art, they're very much personal property. I mean, a famous painter like Michelangelo or Gainsborough or, you know, Constable or Van Gogh, people don't write on their paintings. Imagine if you went into the Louvre and you saw the Mona Lisa, and there up in the top left-hand corner, someone had written a long poem, you know. It wouldn't do. People don't do that in the West. They have a very different attitude towards literature and art. But in China, it's always been different. People don't regard art and literature as private property. Any Chinese poet would learn to write poetry by copying the great masters, by quoting from Du Fu or Li Bai, and that was how they did it. They didn't feel they were robbing them. They didn't feel they were stealing their intellectual property, which is a very American idea anyway. No, they regarded all of literature, all of art, as an expression of the Tao. And the Tao belongs to everybody. The Tao belongs to all of you, belongs to me, it belongs to Songling, it belongs to Cao, it even belongs to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. I mean, everybody has a share of the Tao. They all have the right to that. And I find the comparison between commentaries and these tiba, these colophons they're called, in paintings, very interesting. I've got an example here of a painting by a 17th century artist, not very famous, called Wang Chao, and it's a painting of a lady. And what I've done here, I'm based on the University of Minnesota webpage. I've taken this painting and I've removed the colophon. But if we go to this next one, you can see it. It's not very clear, but up in the left-hand corner, you can see someone's written a long poem on top of the painting. They've added that to the painting, almost like a commentary. And that painting, that inscription is actually by a woman poet called Zhou Qi, who was a great enthusiast of Hong Lao Meng. And this is another of her poems about Hong Lao Meng. And anyway, she wrote this poem onto the paper, onto the painting of Wang Chao. And that was a very common practice in Chinese art. There's a very, very famous painting by Zhao Mengfu, you know, of the Yuan dynasty. It's a landscape painting called, you know, the Qiao Hua Qiu Si, the autumn colors on the Qiao and Hua mountains. And look at all those inscriptions on the painting. Nobody would do that in the Western tradition. You don't write on paintings. That would be regarded as rather bad, you know. But in Chinese art, it's a common practice to write what you might even call a commentary, but they called it a tiba, a colophon, on a painting. And in fact, this painting, which is very famous, if you look at the whole thing, that's a very bad picture, but it shows the whole scroll. And there are just so many of these tiba right the way across. Look, that's what happens with Chinese paintings. And here's another one also by the same painter, and there's a colophon on that too. And if I go back to the words here, you see at the bottom it's these inscriptions. You see, not that one. Sorry, one further back. These inscriptions were actually an intervention. They were the viewer or the owner or the collector taking part in the painting. They were actually joining in the painting in the act of creating a work of art. They didn't feel they were intruding. They were becoming part of it. And the same is true with the commentaries on Chinese literature. They wanted to become part of it. They wanted to join in. They felt it was a collective endeavor, because all literature is an expression of the Tao. And as I said before, the Tao is mine, it's yours, it's Cao Xueqin's, it's Songlin's, and therefore to write a commentary, in this case on a painting, was felt to be completely okay. Now, in the great tradition of Chinese philosophy, the most amazing tradition, going all the way back to the I Ching, the Zhou Yi, and the great classics, the Li Ji and the Shi Jing, of course, all these great classics. And then you come to the great Taoist classic, the Tao Te Ching. These had their commentaries too. And in fact, one of the very earliest commentaries on the Tao Te Ching was by a very interesting man called He Shangong. I call him the River Master. And he probably never existed, to be honest. Sometimes you just invent people and then you write what you want to write, but you call it. I don't think Lao Tzu existed either. I don't think the Yellow Emperor existed, Huangdi. I'm not sure about Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi probably existed, but with Lao Tzu, you see, right from the very early days, there were commentaries. And in fact, this commentary, this commentator, He Shangong, became very famous. That's a modern sculpture of him. But in the Han Dynasty, the great Emperor Han Wendi became very curious. He wanted to meet He Shangong. And he went, according to the story, which is probably a complete myth, he went to find him by the river. And in the course of their conversation about the Tao Te Ching, He Shangong rose up into the air. He floated into the air, you see. And this was the great first commentator on Tao Te Ching. And his commentary is very interesting. When I published my translation of the Tao Te Ching, I included quite a lot of He Shangong's commentary. So in philosophy, and here's a very early edition of his commentary on the Tao Te Ching, on Lao Tzu. And then, of course, much more famous is Zhu Xi from the Song dynasty, who wrote commentaries on all the great classics. And after the Song dynasty, students who are learning the classics, they would have to read not just the classics, but also Zhu Xi's commentary. For example, the great I Ching, everybody read, after the Song dynasty, everybody read the I Ching in the edition with Zhu Xi's commentary, called the Zhou Yi Ben Yi, the original meaning of the I Ching. And even today, people read the I Ching with the commentary by Zhu Xi. So what I'm trying to say is this habit of writing commentaries goes way back in Chinese history, and we don't have anything like it in the West. Of course, there are commentaries on the Bible, there are commentaries on Shakespeare, but they don't tend to get printed alongside the original. In this example here, you see, the actual Jing, the original text, is in very big characters. You can see it, right? And let me see if I can get this red thing to work. Is there a red dot there? No. Anyway, you can see the big characters over on the left, you see, when it says Qian Yuan, and so on and so forth. And then the little characters are the commentary by Zhu Xi. And so this was absolutely part of the tradition. You wrote a commentary. There were commentaries on the great Tang poets. There was a famous commentary on the poetry of Du Fu by Qian Qianyi, and so on and so forth. When we get to fiction, when we get to xiaoshuo, gradually from the Ming dynasty, there started to be commentators who did the same thing. They wrote their commentaries in between the lines. And famously, Jin Shengtan, the great commentator on the Shui Hu Zhuan and also on Xi Xiang Ji, he wrote sometimes very, very long commentaries in his edition of Shui Hu Zhuan, for example, and also Xi Xiang Ji. So when the commentators started writing about fiction, they were inheriting a long tradition of writing commentaries. And in fact, that's where the commentary itself became literature. And it's very famous that when Jin Shengtan was writing a commentary on the famous Yuan dynasty play, Xi Xiang Ji, the great romantic drama of the love affair, between Cui Yingying and Zhang Sheng, full of the most wonderful poetry written to be sung, Jin Shentan wrote a commentary that's almost more famous than the play itself, because in the course of that commentary, he sometimes just took off and wrote long essays of his own. Famously, he wrote that thing called 不以快哉, the 33 happy moments. And he just took off. He just started writing his own literature in the commentary. And it's very, very famous. This is one of the most famous ones, you see. To see someone's kite string being broken, you see. 不以快哉. It's a very wonderful piece of 33不以快哉. It's far more famous than 西厢记, but yet it was originally a commentary. It was written as a commentary on the play 西厢记. But Jin Shentan was so creative. He just wrote it in between the lines of 西厢记. And it's a wonderful essay. I mean, if I had more time, I'd read them all. But so many of the 33不以快哉 really strike home. A wonderful piece of prose, really. A kind of, it's almost like a 小评文, you know, an essay. But it was written in the form of a commentary. Now, all the great novels, 三国演义 and 水浒传 and Jin Pingmei, they all had famous commentators, you see. In the case of Sanguo, there's a man called Mao Zonggan. And in the case of Shui Huzhuan, in addition to Jin Shentan, there's Li Zhi, the famous philosopher, Li Zhuowu. He wrote a famous commentary. And in the case of Jin Pingmei, Zhang Zhupo. Now, I actually don't like Zhang Zhupo's commentary because he's trying to make out that Jin Pingmei is a sort of moralistic tale, and I don't think Jin Pingmei is a moralistic tale at all. Anyway, we won't get into Jin Pingmei today. Maybe next time I come to Hang Seng, I'll give 4 lectures on Jin Pingmei. Then we'll have a big crowd, you know. But I mean, actually, to be honest, I don't like Jin Pingmei at all. I mean, it's a very shocking book. It's a very powerful book, but it's not a book I enjoy. It's a book about people behaving badly, you know. I don't think we need to read books about people behaving badly. I mean, Hong Lao Meng is a nice book. People behave pretty badly there, but I mean, they don't behave as badly as dear old, Xi Menqing. I mean, Xi Menqing is not my favorite person in the world. And as for Pan Jinlian, you know, let's all keep clear of Pan Jinlian, you know. But so, anyway, I won't give any lectures on Jin Pingmei, don't worry. I'm just trying to be misleading. And then we come to my favorite novel, of course, Hong Lao Meng. And there we have a very famous example of the commentator at work. Because there was a man called Zhi Yanzhai. Zhi Yanzhai is a very funny pen name, because it means a rouge inkstone, a red inkstone. And people still fight about who Zhi Yanzhai was. Nobody really knows. He was obviously not just a commentator, he was obviously a member of the family of the writer of Cao Xueqin. And he knew things about the family. And famously, he persuaded the author to change the story about Qin Keqing committing suicide. But his comments really, I mean, one learns so much. In fact, it might not be a he, it might be a woman. I mean, we don't even know if Zhi Yanzhai was a man or a woman, or possibly transgender. I don't know. Nowadays, anything's possible. But I mean, Reddingstone wrote the most extraordinary comments. And I'm going to give you one example. At the very beginning of Hong Lao Meng, the very first page, it talks about Jia Baoyu being a stone who was rejected by Niu Hua when she was repairing the heavens, right? One stone was left unused, and that lay there. It lay there at the foot of a mountain peak. And that mountain peak was called Qing Geng Feng. Qing meaning blue or green. Nobody ever knows whether Qing means blue, green, black, you know. The Chinese language is really an absolute nightmare, you know. You've got a word like Qing, you know, and you don't even know whether it's blue or green, I mean, or black. Imagine having, you know, I mean, I always used to have arguments with my wife about colors because she saw things with the different eyes, and what to her seemed blue, to me seemed gray. That's a physical thing. But with language, you know, Qing, anyway, it means whatever, blue or green. And then you've got this word geng, you see, and very interesting because it means a ridge or something. And Feng, of course, means a mountain peak. And that comes in the novel. It says that Jia Baoyu was a stone, originally a stone, lying at the foot of the Qinggang Feng, right? Now, you could just think that's a mountain of a certain color, maybe a mixture of blue, green, and black, I don't know. Or you could think maybe it has a special subtle meaning. And of course, Zhi Yanzhai, he was on the know. He knew. He was a member of the inside circle. And he wrote in his commentary that Qinggang means Qing, I Qing, the Qing, right? And Gen meaning a root. He said it means that it's the root of love, right? So basically, poor old Jia Baoyu, all his problems go back to love, basically. In fact, later on, the author says, my novel is just about love. It's just about Qing. And we are given a clue. I've written in my title, I said clues from the commentaries. And Zhi Yanzhai is always giving clues. And in this case, he says Qinggang means Qinggen. And of course, an interesting thing is that Geng in modern Mandarin has a G at the end, Geng, whereas Gen doesn't, it's G-N. But actually, I think in Nanjing, they pronounce them the same. Correct me if I'm wrong. But you see, this is the original manuscript with the beautiful red commentary by Zhi Yanzhai. So Zhi Yanzhai was living in a kind of tradition of the commentator, you see, like Jin Shengtan. And he used some of the same expressions as Jin Shengtan. And there he wrote in that commentary, you see, there it is. I've highlighted it. It's 知为罗多清根 故物不天之用, you see. And there it is in his, I've greatly enlarged. He says miao. The commentators are often saying miao, you know. They often say miao, meaning how wonderful, you know. You know, some people when they're writing emails, they reply, oh, wonderful, wonderful. And the same with the commentator. They're often just saying miao, wonderful, you know. Apparently, Mao Zedong, when he was in his old age, used to get copies of books from the National Library. And sorry, this is rather relevant. I'm not being political. Mao Zedong liked to write on them, you know. He thought of himself as a great Zhifunzi. He thought he was a great intellectual. And he would write on these priceless Song Dynasty copies. He'd scribble on them. And he would usually just write Hao, because he didn't really have much to say. He just wrote Hao. And later on, after he died, the librarian at the Tushuguan, they're very embarrassed because they wanted to remove Mao's scribble. Because, you know, Mao's shufa is just, well, I think it's very ugly, but of course it's supposed to be very special based on the famous Tang calligrapher Huai Su. But he would scribble all over things, and that he regarded himself as a great commentator, you know. Well, I mean, he was in a sense living in that tradition. Anyway, that's Zhi Yanzhai, and in fact, this is the translation. You see, when my father-in-law David Hawkes translated that first page, he got to the very end when he said she used 36,500 of these blocks. She is Nuwa, the goddess, right? She used 36,500 of these blocks in the course of her building operations, leaving a single odd block unused, which lay all on its own at the foot of Green Sickness Peak in the aforementioned mountains. Now, I'm interested in how translators can be helped to read, because a translator has to be a reader, right? And David Hawkes, when he translated this, was reading Zhi Yanzhai's commentary, right? So he knew that Qinggang was also Qinggen. So he wanted to translate it so that there was something of that double meaning included in his translation. And he used the word green sickness. Now, green sickness is a very old English word meaning love sickness. It means it's used especially of young ladies. And it comes in Shakespeare, it comes in Romeo and Juliet. When Juliet is in love with Romeo, her father criticizes her and he calls her, you green sickness carrion, you wretched girl, to be so much in love with somebody, you're causing trouble, you see. And here, David, my father-in-law, used the word green sickness to try and capture the double meaning of Qinggang and Qinggen, you see. So he says, what he's saying is that this stone, the stone is Jia Bao Yu, the stone is lying at the foot of a mountain called, if you like, called love. That's to put it too simply. But rather than put it simply, the translator, taking his clue from Zhiyanzhai, calls it Green Sickness Peak. And you've got to unravel that mystery. What is Green Sickness Peak? Most people have no idea. We don't talk about green sickness today. You know, if somebody writes to their mother, oh, I'm so in love, they don't say, dear mummy, I'm having green sickness. Her mother would say, take paracetamol and go to bed. You know, it's not a word that people use today. But somebody who knows literature would recognize it as being a quotation from Shakespeare. And of course, not only is it a quotation from Shakespeare, it's a quotation from Romeo and Juliet, the greatest love tragedy ever written. And Hong Lao Meng is, of course, also a love tragedy. So, thanks to that clue from the commentator, the translator here was able to put an awful lot of hidden meaning into his translation. It's an example of how the translator can also learn from the commentator. And when I'm translating蒲松龄's Liao Zhai stories, I'm always reading the commentators. I find them very, very helpful, because they knew how to read, they knew how to understand these wonderful stories. And now this, I'm going to skip through this because I always prepare much too much stuff, and I want to leave time for questions. This is basically an extract from chapter 3 of Hong Lao Meng, with the commentary translated. And I could spend the next half an hour talking about it, but I'm not going to. I'm just pointing out to you that stuff in red is a translation of the commentary by Zhiyanzhai. And it's all there. You can take it home. It's on your handout. And the main point of this is to show that these translators were really, really helpful. Here again, he says miao. You know, miao. Everything's every time. Miao is like putting a tick. You know, it's like saying 3-star or Michelin 3-star restaurant. Miao. You know. So we'll just take that as read, and we'll move on. If I have time, I'll come back to it at the end. Excuse me. Okay, now we've come to the real subject of my talk, which is the 5 early commentators who are writing about Liao Zhai. And these 5 men, really, each of them is remarkable in their own way. They started basically writing commentaries on the stories in the early 19th century. You see the dates there, 1818, 1823, 25, 39, 42. So these were all in the first half of the 19th century. And they were different types of commentators, because basically you've got what you might call the ping, and then you've got the zhu. And the ping were basically literary. They were making literary comments about the nature of the writing, about the artistry, the craft, the fine choice of words, that kind of thing. So you see, Feng Zhenluan and He Shouqi, they are both ping jia. But Liu Jianan, the third one, he's a zhu, and so is He Yin, you see. So the number 3 and 4, they were giving the meanings of words. And sometimes, for example, especially in the case of Liu Jianan, he's a brilliant commentator, they were giving the allusions. Liu Jianan often says, oh, this is from the Chunshu Zuozhuan, or this is from, such and such a classic. And he's very helpful, because he realized even in 1825 that his readers needed help. They're more his comments are more like modern footnotes, giving you information, not making critical literary comments, but giving you information about the meaning of words and the allusions made by, because蒲松龄was always making allusions. He spent his life preparing for the examinations, never succeeding, but he kept trying. And he knew all the classics so well. He knew Chunshu Zuozhuan, especially the Zuozhuan. And so Liu Jianen, he picks up on all the allusions, and sometimes if there's a difficult word, a single word, he'll give the meaning of it. He'll even give the pronunciation. And He Yin is very similar. Dan Minglun, the number 5, he's more of a literary critic, a bit like, for me, the most helpful really are Feng Zhenluan and Dan Minglun, because between them, they're commenting on蒲松龄's skill as a writer, the way he tells the story, the way he portrays character, the way he talks about human emotion. They're very, very good about that. The others are very helpful in other ways, but these... So these 5 people are the 5 early commentators on Liao Zhai, and they're coming to be widely recognized. In the last 10 or 20 years, more and more scholars, especially in mainland China, are writing about these people and telling us something of their lives, discovering about how each of them is actually an interesting person in their own way. Dan Minglun, the last one, he was the most successful in the public field. He became quite an interesting public figure, a magistrate and so on. The others were less successful in their public life, but just as interesting as critics. We even have a picture of Dan Minglun because he was quite a well-known public figure. So it's rather a nice picture. I was trying to work out what kind of a beard he has. It's not very clear from the picture. I'm quite interested in beards and different styles of beard. And I think I'm not quite sure because you can't see, but I think he's got quite a bushy beard. Anyway, that's Dan Minglun. This is one of the very earliest editions with commentaries by He Shouqi and also by Wang Shizhen, who was actually a contemporary of蒲松龄's, but not very many comments by them. Now, this is something I'm particularly fond of. Feng Zhenluan, interesting man. He actually wrote a separate essay called聊斋誌異度法. And I've translated this. This comes in my first book of蒲松龄stories. I did one collection in 2006 of 104 stories, but in the I wrote a long introduction to it, and in that introduction I translated some of Feng Zhenluan's Dufa. Let me see if I've got it on the handout, because I'm having trouble reading this. Yes. I think this is worth reading in full because it really captures the spirit of Feng Zhenluan. He's rather like Jin Shengtan, He uses the commentary as a way of self-expression. And he wrote here, this book, meaning Liao Zhai, should be read as one reads the records of the historian. That's the Shiji by Sima Qian. The records, the Shiji, are bold and striking. The strange tales are dark and understated. I think that's so important.蒲松龄is a master of understatement. For example,蒲松龄's stories, they would be, I would say, considered to be erotic. They talk about physical love, but in a very understated way. There are never any graphic physical descriptions of the act of love. It just says this beautiful girl came into his studio and within a matter of minutes they were in bed together, enjoying each other, and the next morning she wanted, that's all. It doesn't go into a kind of blow-by-blow account like Jinping Mei, totally different, very understated. One enters this book, now he's talking about reading Liao Zhai, you see. He uses a kind of very poetic way of talking. One enters this book with a lantern in the shadows of night. One comes out of it into the daylight under a blue sky. Its few words evoke mighty landscapes and create magical realms. It is both bold and dark. It is both striking and understated. Then he goes on, this book should be read as one reads the epigrams of the Neo-Confucian philosophers, the Yu Lu, the records of their conversations. In the epigrams, the sense is pure. In the strange tales, the sensibility is well-tuned. It's a very refined style of writing. Every time one thinks a situation weird, it is in fact very real and true to human nature. It contains both pure sense and pure sensibility. Now this is a comment people always making about Liao Zhai, including Lu Xun. Lu Xun says the same thing. Although it's very weird, although his stories are very strange, they're also very real and very true to human nature. That's what's so remarkable about them. Anyway, then Feng Zhenman goes on. When wind and snow fill the sky, and my fire has grown cold, my page boy relights the coals and heats my wine. I dust my desk and turn up the wick of my lamp. When I come across a passage that catches my fancy, I quickly dash off a few lines. In other words, as he reads the Liao Zhai, he's also expressing himself. He's also adding his poetic comments. Then he concludes with these words. By the way, it's on page 7 of the handout. He concludes by saying, read these tales properly, and they will make you strong and brave. Read them in the wrong way, and they will possess you. I think he's talking about the possession, which in Chinese is usually called 走火入魔, when you allow a bad spirit to enter into you, So read them properly, read them for the deeper meaning, and they will help you to be strong and brave. But read them in a bad way, and they'll give you trouble, Cling to the details, and they'll possess you. Don't get obsessed with little details, but instead grasp the spirit, and you will be strong. Appreciate the wonders of the style, see into the author's subtle intentions, grasp the human qualities of his characters, and value his thoughts. Then this book will be a unique guide to you in your own inner development. It will transform your character and purify your heart. I think that's the most wonderful summary of his idea of how to read these stories. Don't read them for kicks, Don't read them for some kind of thrills, Read them to purify your heart. I think that's absolutely true. Now, we're very lucky because in the 1950s, a gentleman by the name of Zhang Youhe was working for a publishing house in Peking. I think it was Zhonghua Shuju. And he spent years collecting all these commentaries and making them into a book. So he produced a book which is still available called Hui Jiao Hui. I can't read the thing, but luckily they have a copy here in the Hang Seng Library of this book, and it contains all the commentaries that all those 5 commentators are collected together in this book. It's terribly, terribly useful, and yes, I thoroughly recommend it. There are also editions like this of Hong Lao Meng that contain all the commentators. They're very, very helpful. Now, I'm going to now, for the second half of my talk, I think I'll take a 5-minute break. Is that okay, William? 5-minute break? Okay, it's 2:45, and I'll start again in 5 minutes, because the next part is really a single story. I want to go through with you a single story in detail, showing you how the commentary really helps to understand the story. But we'll take a 5-minute break. Thank you. I'm going to go through the whole story because it really is a most remarkable story. It's a story that's very seldom included in selections from Liao Zhai. I think you'll see why. It's a topic which is extremely controversial and I think modern and very, very unusual in terms of human psychology. You'll see as the story progresses. In the county of Shaoxing, in the province of Zhejiang, there lived an old widow who wove and spun thread all through the night. Now, at this point, Feng Zhenwan can't resist but adding a comment. How much of the tale's innermost thread of passion is contained in those 4 words, you see, all through the night. So he's already saying, we've been given a clue by蒲松龄about this old lady. One night, a woman pushed open the door of her room and entered. I mean,蒲松龄is almost writing film scripts. Every time he writes, he has an incredible feel for visual detail, for dramatic timing. So there's an old lady, she's sitting up all night, weaving and spinning, and one night a woman simply pushes open the door and walks in. "You must be so weary, dear lady," she said with a kindly smile. This comment here in those square brackets is actually taken not from one of the 19th century commentators, but from a 21st century online commentary. I've recently become very aware of the incredible variety of online commentaries on Liao Zhai. I think it's an extraordinary thing. People are obviously still reading these stories a lot. And some of the comments are very helpful. Sometimes they're helpful about the meanings of words. In this case, one of the commentators explains, what this Wu Nai Lao Hu means. And anyway, the old widow looked at her more closely and beheld a young woman of 18 or 19, of great charm and beauty, dressed in a dazzling gown. And this is where Dan Minglun now comes in. The commentators are almost like friends. He comes in and says, this is the world of form and desire. You see, the searching. And Dan Minglun is now giving us a clue as to the real topic of this story. It's a story about desire and about the world of form, the Buddhist expression, si, and the old lady, anyway, she looks up and she sees this incredibly beautiful young woman walking into her room in the middle of the night while she's weaving away. And she says to her, "Where are you from, my dear?" she asked in some amazement. "Well, I was feeling sorry for you." This is the young lady replies. "I was feeling sorry for you working away here all on your own, so I thought I'd come and keep you company," was the reply. And Dan Minglun says, first sign of the spell of passion, Qing Zhang, you see. And here again, I've in square brackets is from the modern commentator, who's a lot more straightforward. This is the begin. This is the first sign of the way Qingyu, the way passion and desire are interfering in people's lives. You see, the whole story is about that. The old widow at first feared that she might have run away from some noble family and questioned her more closely. So immediately we're entering into the psychology of the situation. The old lady is sitting on her bed, a beautiful young thing comes in, and the old lady wonders, oh my goodness, maybe she's run away from somebody down the road, maybe she's a concubine or something who's trying to escape. And she's starting to wonder and to be a little bit perplexed. What's going on here? "Please do not be afraid," she replied. "I too am all alone in the world, like you. I was touched by your purity and have come here to share your toil and solitude. Can that not be a comfort to us both?" And Feng Zhenwan at this point says, her tender words engender passion, you see. Ru Qing, again, the theme of this whole story, as indeed of many, many Liao Zhai stories, is that word Qing, which is very, very hard to translate because it includes the whole range of emotions, from simple affection between friends, you Qing, and love, ai Qing, but also, physical passion. And love, affection, passion are all included in this word Qing. I'm currently editing a book which I'm calling the Chinese Book of Love. And I'm calling it in Chinese simply Qing, because I've chosen works from Chinese literature to represent the full range of emotions included in that word qing. And here Feng Zhenwan is saying that these nice words of hers are actually a kind of signaling the entry, the ru, into the qing, which is the theme of this story. Now the old lady began to suspect that she might be a fox spirit. So she started to think, oh my goodness, I'm being visited by a Huli Jing, you see. And she at once became silent and unforthcoming. So it's quite subtle. This old lady thinks, oh dear, am I about to be possessed by a Huli Jing? Dear, oh dear, what's happening? But the young woman, undeterred, climbed up onto the couch beside her and began to help her with the spinning. Set your mind at rest, dear lady, she said. This is a task I can perform very well. I will not be a burden for you. And the one in square brackets is just a helpful explanation from the internet. But Feng Zhenwan, you see, says here that this dramatic movement where the girl climbs up onto the bed keeps the narrative going, you see. He's talking about the skill of Songling in telling a story. So far, we've had a simple situation. Old lady doing her spinning, young woman comes in, and in the middle of the night, completely unexpectedly, and they have a little exchange, and then she climbs up onto the bed to help her with the spinning. So there's an element of suspense there. And it keeps the narrative moving. Because telling a story is a real art, you know, narrative. Her kind words and gentle manner finally won the widow over. Later that night, the woman said to her, the quilt and pillow that I brought with me are still outside the door. So she's brought her bedding with her. Interesting detail. When you go out to relieve yourself, would you be so good as to bring them in? I mean, Songling just casually says, when you go out for a pee, darling, you know, would you mind bringing in my bedding? It's outside. These are very lovely little details, but they're very understated. But he's terribly human, you know. When you go out in a minute, you know, to relieve yourself, would you bring in my bedding, my sleeping bag kind of thing, you know? And sure enough, when the widow went outside, she found a bundle lying there. When she laid the bedding out, it contained, when she laid the bedding it contained on the couch, she found that it was made from a rare silken fabric, sweet-smelling, glistening, and smooth to the touch. Little physical details about that are helping to set the scene. Now I'm behaving like a commentator. I'm putting in my little bit, you know, because I can't help it, because the translator is a kind of commentator. The translator is a reader who intervenes and starts to put the thing into a new language. So I'm a kind of commentator myself. I can call myself, you know, Minford, Minping, you know, and this beautiful bedding is not a kind of cheap bedding. It's expensive. It's silk. It's lovely and soft, and it has a lovely fragrance, you know, sweet smelling. The old widow spread out her own plain cotton quilt, because she's a poor lady. She's just a simple peasant woman, probably. And that night she shared her bed with the young woman, who undid her silken gown. As she did so, filling the room with a strange scent. And Dan Minglun says, you know, 四声真诚. So this added touch, this little touch about the perfume that emanated from this young woman, takes us into the world of desire. You see, the 四声. So the two key words, if we use the modern expression key word, you know, the two key words so far are qing and 四. But unlike Jinping Mei, it's not going to be about sort of sexual acrobatics. It's very much more subtle, very much more understated, but in a way equally shocking. As the two of them lay down to sleep, and this is where the story starts to get a little bit hotter, the old widow, found herself thinking to herself, how beautiful this woman is. If only I were a man. Now this is where the reader starts to think, wait a minute, what's going on here? And Dan says, a further touch evoking the spell of passion, the Qingzhang. And Feng Zhenwan, I feel attracted to the young woman myself. I mean, this is the typical commentator saying, you know, I think the girl's really sexy, you know, myself. How could the old dame not feel the same? It's very chatty. It's very wanting to share, wanting to join in, you know. So Feng Zhenwan thinks, yes, this is starting to get quite interesting. I think she's quite pretty, you know. And the young woman who was lying beside her smiled and said, Mother dear, you're already 70 years old. Are you still having such naughty thoughts? And Dan says, it takes passion to be moved by passion. It takes feeling to know feeling. And this is the key thing, because as it turns out, both of these ladies feel attracted to each other. It's not just the old lady who wants to be a man and have sex with the girl. It's also the young woman. You'll find out later. But anyway, the widow denied having had any such naughty thoughts, even though she had. She denied it, right? Well, said the young woman, if that's the case, how come just now you were wishing you were a man? And Feng said, this put me in mind of, and I couldn't find out about this reference, I'm afraid. I'll have to find out later. The widow now knew for sure that the young woman must be a fox spirit, and she grew greatly afraid. The woman smiled again. If you were brave enough to want to be a man, how come you're so frightened of me? This only made the old widow more terrified than ever, and she began trembling and rocking the bedstead. Dearie, oh dearie me, said the woman, if you're as easily scared as that, how could you ever hope to be a man? Let me tell you the truth. I am no ordinary mortal, but I will bring you no harm. Just be very discreet and honest in what you say about us to others, and all will be well. With me here, you will never lack for food or clothing. You'll always lead a life of comfort and ease. Well, first thing the next morning, the old widow rose and prostrated herself by the side of the bed. The woman reached out an arm to help her up to her feet. Her skin was smooth and soft as alabaster and gave off a warm and almost tangible fragrance. When the old widow touched it, it caused a deliciously melting sensation. Here's where Dan comes in and says, the world of desire comes fully into focus. Once again, she was quite carried away and began indulging in all manner of fantasies. And then Dan says, now she's truly fallen under the spell of passion. The woman laughed. You've only just got over your fit of terror, and there you go again. If you really were a man, I'm afraid passion would be the death of you. Yes, replied the old widow, you're right. If I were to become a man, I'm sure I would die of passion this very night. And Dan Minung says, deeply under the spell of passion. He's really emphasizing this point, you know. The two of them became fast friends and spent their days happily working together. And this is where Feng really gives away the secret. He says, I think these strange tales are a very dharani. A dharani is like a sutra. It's like a sacred scripture, a holy scripture of the tender land of sensuality and pleasure. Every time they tell of the love between man and woman, this profound teaching shines through the page. These are no idle romances. Now the thread spun by the young woman was even and fine and glistened in the light. When added to a weave, it helped to make a cloth that was lustrous as brocade and sold for 3 times the normal price. Whenever the old widow went out, she made sure to lock the door of the house securely, and if any visitors called, she made a point of receiving them in a separate room. 6 months went by uneventfully in this fashion, and their secret remained tightly guarded. But then gradually the widow let slip 1 or 2 hints to some of her friends and relatives, and soon the women in the village were all begging her to let them see her treasure. Her young friend reproached her. You've given away our secret. Now I shall not be able to stay here much longer. The widow greatly regretted her indiscretion and blamed herself bitterly for it. But all the time, the number of requests from her friends was increasing, and some of the women were using their influence to put pressure on her. She told the young woman about this with tears in her eyes. Ladies of your personal acquaintance, she replied, the young woman replied, can come and have a look. But I fear there may be more lecherous young fellows wanting to take liberty. There may be some lecherous young fellow wanting to take liberties. And this is the famous character xia, which is always used by Songling to indicate physical intimacy. He'll want to do a great deal more than just look. So that the Huli Jing is already on her guard. The old widow pleaded with her. Sorry, my mouth is terribly dry. The old widow pleaded with her to let the ladies come. In the end, she agreed, and the very next day there was quite a crowd of them, young and old, queuing up outside with sticks of burning incense in their hands. The young woman found it all rather irksome and refused to speak to a single one of them, whether humble maid or nobly born lady, but just sat there motionless and silent, listening to their prayers and words of adoration. Word of her now inevitably spread to the young men of the village, who became quite obsessed with the thought of this great beauty, and were all agog to see her. But the widow turned them all away, except for one gentleman named Fei, a man of some distinction in the county, who sold everything he had in order to bribe her into letting him see the woman. Finally, the widow agreed to try and ask on his behalf. She put the matter to the young woman, who knew all about it already, and reproached her. So now you're making money out of me. The old widow fell to her knees and confessed that she had done wrong. So she's taking a bribe from this local man who wants to come and have a look at the young lady, who's apparently very beautiful. Well, conceded the young woman, you may have had your head turned by his money, but I was moved by the folly of his passion. And this is where Dan Minlung says, she has truly fallen deeply under the spell of passion. And goes on to say, moved by folly, these are the words of an immortal, of a Buddha. Now, you see, what's happened is the young girl herself has become possessed by passion. She hears about a very wealthy man who's prepared to sell everything in order to have a look at her. And she starts to feel passion herself. Very well, he can see me once, but after that you and I must part forever. The widow knocked her head on the floor. The young woman set the following day as the time for the rendezvous. When Mr. Fei heard this, he was overjoyed and set off with his incense candles. Arriving at the door, he made a profound bow, and from behind the cloth portiere, that's the door curtain, the woman spoke to him. So she's hidden from him by a curtain, but she speaks. And she says, I know, sir, that in order to see me, you've sold everything you possess. Tell me, what is it that you so wish to say to me? And Dan says, the world of desire, the spell of passion. My one and only desire in coming here, replied the man, was to see you. The great beauties of legend can never be more to us than legends. They will always remain creatures of the imagination. We will never be able to set eyes on them. But you are real. If you could deign to bestow upon my unworthy self the briefest glimpse of your beauty, it will satisfy my heart's desire. Dan Minglun says, this is the very height of the world of desire and the spell of passion. If destiny does not vouchsafe me this joy, it will be for me a source of the deepest sorrow. And Feng Zhenruan says, exquisitely put, you say, 此灵妙, it's a miao pin. Even as he finished speaking, so now we've reached the climax of the story. The old lady has allowed her friends, her lady friends, to come and have a quick look at this beautiful girl. And then finally, she's bribed by this man, a man, to let him come and have a look. And he pays her a lot of money. And then when the Huli Jing hears about this, she's flattered. She's also aroused. I mean, she's basically aroused aroused to passion by the idea that somebody very wealthy is prepared to sell everything, his house, his stocks and shares, his car, just to come and have a look at her. She gets quite excited by that. And they have that little conversation. And she's behind the curtain. She's talking to him from behind a curtain. Even as he finished speaking these words, he saw her face shining clearly right through the fabric of the portiere. So this magical woman, this not ordinary mortal, is now able to project her beauty through the curtain. He sees her like an infrared picture. He sees her beauty coming through the curtain. The glistening curve of her turquoise eyebrows, her crimson lips, every detail was bright as life itself. It was as if there was no curtain between them. And Dan says, we see that the world of desire and the spell of passion are one and the same thing. His soul was utterly ravished, Mr. Fay, and he fell to the ground in a transport of ecstasy. When he finally stood up again, the portiere was hanging there just as before, solid and heavy. So you see, when he stood up, he could see nothing. And Dan says, the spell of passion has been broken. And though he could still hear the woman's voice, he could see her person no more. The man was plunged in despair and secretly regretted that his eyes had not been granted a single glimpse of her golden lotuses, the lower, more private part of her body. And this is where John Minford writes a comment. Min Ping. The Western reader might so easily misunderstand this expression. So it has to be made more explicit by the translator to bring to life the obsession of traditional Chinese men of letters with the woman's bound foot. Because he's saying to himself, the Chinese is xia ti, her lower body. It doesn't mean her private parts, it means her feet. Because for the man, the ultimate object of excitement is her bound feet. I mean, to us it seems strange, but to蒲松龄's time, it was a normal thing. The next instant he beheld, peeping beneath the curtain, the two curving tips of her embroidered shoes, tapering to a tiny finger's width, and he fell to the ground again in a swoon of adoration. So this is the climax of the story. This man who's sold everything to come and have a look at her finally sees her tiny, tiny feet underneath the curtain, and he simply falls to the ground. He's so excited he can't even stand up. I mean, it's understated, but it's very erotic. Now here's I'm afraid the print has got smaller. The voice spoke once more from behind the curtain. You really must go home now, sir. I am weary. And Feng says, poignant words, you see. And Dan says, this is the high point of desire. This is the climax of the spell of passion. So the girl is actually quite aroused herself. And she says, you must go now. I'm tired. This experience has actually tired me. The old widow took her visitor out into another room where she served him tea. He next was moved to inscribe a stanza of lyric verse on the wall to the tune In the Southern Country, as follows. And now we have a little comment by HSUHK who says, nice touch, hao. That's what Chairman Ma used to write, hao. And here comes the poem, you see. Dimly through the curtain I beheld your tiny lotus buds, those delicately tapering shoots of jade, which touched the ground light as lily petals. They would have been lovelier still enclosed in filigree shoes. My hands so nearly touched the embroidered flowers around the phoenix, soft as silken floss. Would that I were a butterfly fluttering at the hem of your skirt, one breath of your sweet perfume, and I would gladly have died. HSUHK thinks it's absolutely marvelous. I don't think it's a very good poem, actually, but and having completed his description, Mr. Fay remarked to the old widow, I said that you and I were destined to part forever. No. Today those words of mine must... No, that's actually a typo. And the widow fell to the ground and pleaded with her to... It was the young girl who said that, when we are destined to... So when Mr. Fay had completed his inscription, the young girl said to the old lady, I said that we'd have to part forever. Today those words of mine must come true. The widow fell to the ground and pleaded with her to relent. I must confess, said the young woman, that in this matter the fault is not entirely yours. I too allowed myself to fall under the spell of passion. I showed myself to a man in the worldly form of desire. As a consequence, I myself have been sullied by his lustful words. And Dan Minlung says, to show herself in the worldly form of desire was itself almost an act of lust, of which his lustful words were merely the inevitable consequence. And the young woman goes on, this was my doing, had nothing to do with you. But if I do not now make haste to leave this place, I fear I might fall still more deeply into the pit of passion and never be able to find my way out of it again. And this is where Feng Zhenwan quotes Zhu Xi and Yuan Mei on the all-pervading nature of passion. With these words, the young woman bundled up her things and set out on her way. And Dan says, she is pure at last. The old widow hurried after her and sought to call her back, but she had already vanished into the night. Sorry, it's rather an exhausting story because it's not very long, it's quite short, but it's very, very intense. And describing first of all, the love between an elderly lady and a very young and beautiful fox spirit. That's the first half. Very, very delicately put, very, very, very touching, you know, that this old weaving lady is suddenly confronted with this beautiful creature, and they have a very charming life together. And after a number of months, people find out, and then eventually this man cannot contain himself, and he sells everything to have a glimpse of the girl. But it turns out that the girl herself has been inflamed by passion, and she ends up saying to the old lady, "It's not your fault. I've got to go now. But I mean, I myself fell into the pit of passion. I was possessed by the spirit of desire and lust." And it's a very short but extremely poignant story, I think, which conjures up an encounter. Well, it's actually a triple encounter because there are really three people involved, but an encounter of great sensual intensity. It's about the senses. Se, the word se, I mean the two key words here which are emphasized again and again by the commentators are se and qing, and the se is what we see, literally the color. It's a Buddhist term for the sensual world, the world of sensual experience, the world of sensual pleasure, and qing, which is the world of, as I said earlier, the whole range of emotions that go along with that. So the whole, and actually Feng Menlung says Feng Menluan says this story is a dharani, it's a sutra, it's like a sacred scripture on the subject of passion and desire, of se and qing. And thanks to those commentators, we're able to see beyond the details of the story. I mean, that's where Feng Zhenwan says, if you just get hooked on the details, you're going to have a bad time. You've got to go to the real essence, the real message behind it. And in this case, I think that those commentators, Dan Ming, especially those two, Feng Zhenwan and Dan Minglun, they're the ones who really give us the clues as to what is the real message of the story. And therefore, as Feng Zhenwan says, if you concentrate on the message, you will be brave and you will be strong. It will make you a better person. It will make you a stronger person. But if you just get excited by the details, you know, oh my goodness, those little feet, how exciting, you know, you're really going to be in trouble. You're going to be possessed. So you've got to see beyond that. You've got to see beyond that to the deeper meaning of the story. And in this case, the commentators are the ones who enable us to see that deeper meaning. And in the end, they're very helpful not only to the reader, the Chinese reader who's reading the story in Chinese, but also to the translator who's trying to get to the heart of the matter, you know. And that's really what I have to say today. And it will lead into what I'm talking about next week, because my last lecture next Saturday, the day before I leave, I'm going to talk about the translator and how the translator has to deal with this, and how hard it is for a translator to cope with this kind of writing, which is it's so subtle, it's so elusive, it's so understated, it's so beautiful as well. He writes almost poetry, although it's prose, it's wenyan, but he writes with the skill of a poet, and therefore I would argue that for the translator today, those commentators are really, really helpful. They are the friends of the translator. Good, well, I think I'll stop there, and we've got time for questions. If anyone wants to ask any questions, you go ahead. I may not be able to answer them, but I'll do my best. And don't be shy. I mean, just you can ask any questions you like, within reason. I don't think we've got Gilbert here. Gilbert normally is the one who asks all the questions. Don't think Gilbert's here. Could I ask you to speak slowly and loudly, because I'm very hard of hearing. Maybe you need to switch the microphone on. Try that one.
Hello.
That's better. Loud and clear, please, and slow.
Okay. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. And
Thank you.
I would like to ask, how did you determine the legitimacy of the commentaries? Like, how would you think that it is appropriate for the translation? How would you think it is useful? And also, if there's any conflicts between commentaries, how would you handle that?
Sorry, could you repeat that last part, if there was any?
If there was any conflicts between the commentaries, between the different commentaries, how would you choose one of them over the other one?
Is there any conflict? Well, thank you. I mean, it took me a while to discover these commentators. I mean, I started studying蒲松龄in 1991 when I went to live in France, and that's more than 30 years ago. And then I first of all read the stories in a very modern edition, with just footnotes. But gradually, as time went by, I was introduced to the Zhang Youhe's collection of commentaries, which I've got it here in my bag, but it's in the library here. He spent many years collecting these commentaries and making a modern edition with the commentaries in them. I didn't have to find rare old books. They were there in this modern. It's always being reprinted today by Shanghai Guji Chubanshe, and there was the material. Now, it took me a while to realize that these commentators were really very helpful in terms of what they said about the story, what they said about the words, the allusions, and also about the poetic message of the stories. Because, I've always felt that蒲松龄was fundamentally a poet, He has a poetic sensibility, and he's writing about human experience from a poetic point of view. He's not a cheap writer having a bit of a thrill, He was a writer trying to talk about human emotion. Just like Cao Sui-chin. Cao Sui-chin said Hong Lamang is simply a novel about Qing, And I think in that respect,蒲松龄and Cao Sui-chin have a lot in common. And I've had to struggle for many years to try and get to what I feel is the real voice of蒲松龄. And these commentators definitely helped me. They became my sort of companions in a way. And I think sometimes, yes, there is a conflict. I think sometimes, for example, He Shouqi, for example, wrote that poem written by, I mean, Mr. Fay writes a poem which is frankly rather kind of silly, you know, just saying, I was so excited by your feet, basically. I mean, you don't need to write a poem about that. And I don't think it was a very good poem. But I mean, and neither Feng nor Dan say good things about it. But He Shouji said, how? He thought it was written really well, you know. I don't think they necessarily always agree. But on the whole, they're all trying to do the same thing, which is to get beneath the surface, underneath the skin of the writer, you know. Liu Jian'en and He Yin, they're more concerned with individual words. And sometimes, for example, there's another story I talked about earlier on this year called Xu Huangliang, about the scholar who has a dream. And it goes back to a Tang Dynasty Chuanqi called Zhen Zhongji, The Story and the Pillow. And on that occasion, Liu Jian'en gives the whole story in his commentary because he thinks his readers might not know the story. So that's also very useful. I mean, I learn a huge amount from those commentators. And the modern footnotes are much less helpful. The modern footnotes are helpful in a way because they give simple explanations, and they're more modern. So they sometimes tell you things about Shandong province and stuff. But I mean, these old commentators like Dan Minglun, you know, I must see if I can find that picture of him. Because what's happened to my thing? I think we've gone on to something else, right? Can we get on to my thing? Oh, yeah. Let's go back to that picture of Dan Minglun as we're talking about commentators. I like it very much. There he is. This is one of them. This is the only picture I could find of the 5 commentators. And he was a very, very interesting man. He wrote a lot of things, and he was a very perceptive commentator. And he became my reading companion, you know. He was like reading over my shoulder, saying, look at that, don't ignore that, don't forget that, you know, don't forget to translate that, you know. And don't get carried away by that. But the real story, this story I've just shared with you, is really a story about temptation, passion, desire. And it's felt by 3 people: the old lady, the young Hu Lijing, and the old man who sells all his goods. It's about the way it works. People become attracted to each other, and then they get led down a bad path. I mean, he was basically saying, you've got to be careful, you know, in matters of attraction. What we call today mutual attraction may not be very reliable. It may lead you into trouble. That's what he's saying. It's very modern sometimes. I mean,蒲松龄is a very modern writer, very psychological. It's all about psychology. And this is a triangle. This is a triangular situation: an old lady, a young lady, and a man, a rich man. And it's all about the workings of attraction, physical attraction, basically. So no, I find them very, very helpful. I find them more and more helpful, actually, as I get deeper and deeper into the stories.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I would like to ask, what difficulties you encountered when you translate蒲松龄, and how you solved it with the help of commentaries?
Sorry, can you read the last part? How did I solve it?
And how you solve the challenges with the help of commentaries?
Okay. My goodness. I'll be talking about that next week, about translation, but I mean, very briefly, it's terribly difficult. I think translating蒲松龄is very, very difficult because of his style. He has a very, very difficult style. He chose to write in a particularly difficult kind of Wenyan, you know, and often he chose very difficult individual words because he wanted to express something very subtle. He's a very subtle writer, and I think to answer the second part of your question, that's where the commentators encouraged me to keep searching for meaning, you know, never to try and go beyond the surface. A translator has to try to capture the hidden meaning of works. Let me give you another example, nothing to do with Songling. I once translated the poems of an old gentleman. He was still alive, but he wrote 29 poems, and his son asked me to translate them. They were 词 poems in the style of, Song Ci. And when I delivered my translation to the son, I said to him, there are 6 sentences I don't understand. I can't translate. Could you help me? And this man came to see me and he said, the reason you can't understand them is because they're supposed to be secret. They're about my father's love affair with a young lady, and he doesn't want his wife to know. So I said, well, give me a break. A translator can't cope with that kind of thing. So you tell me the true story. So he told me the true story about this this love affair. And then, so I translated them, and then he showed them to his father, and his father said, for goodness sake, that's much too obvious. You've got to hide, you've got to cover it all up again. So I had to learn. If you like, the son was like a commentator. He was like my friend. He became my friend. He showed me the true underlying meaning. But then I had to, having found the underlying meaning, I then had to cover it up again because the author wished it to remain a secret. So there are all sorts of hidden secrets in that. And I think with Songling it's the same. There's so much hidden meaning, There's so much. He hints at things a lot. He never, as I said earlier on, he never describes physical love in any kind of detail, not like Jinping Mei, but he suggests it. It's very suggestive, Sometimes it's what you don't write that is really suggestive, You leave it to the imagination of the reader, And that's where the translator has to try to cultivate a style which is somehow similar. And that's hard work. I spent ages reading English literature of the same kind, and still today I'm not satisfied with my own ability to really recreate these stories. It's very demanding. It's very but it's also very rewarding for the translator. I've learned a great deal from doing this about literature, about language, but also about life. About the way he talks about human experience. It makes me feel that my own way of talking about it is very clumsy. His is very elegant, very understated, very poignant, very suggestive, really. I think more than anything else, I want to try to make the translations suggestive so that people have my book by the bedside and they read a story last thing at night and they drift off into a world of fantasy and dreams, and it makes their world more richer and more entertaining and more suggestive. So it's a kind of pursuit of the magic of the written word, really, in the end.
So thank you so much.
Anybody else? John, maybe start.
As we have no, I'm going to ask myself a question. Oh, there is one over there. Okay. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you for sharing your insights with us. Can I ask something a little bit off topic, but related to the translation? What do you think about the machine translation, the AI translation? Because sometimes people keep mentioning, telling the translator like that, you'll be replaced by the AI. What do you think about it?
Are you trying to annoy me or what? I think the day when a machine can translate Songling is the day when basically the world becomes heaven. I mean, come on. I remember at the very beginning of machine translation, when I was teaching at PolyU at Ligong, somebody in Google, they fed in Alice in Wonderland into a machine translate it into Chinese. It turned into a chemical thesis about chemistry, right? Now, today, of course, AI is amazingly clever and so on and so forth. They will never even stand a chance of capturing the magic of Songling. You know, machine translation is very useful for all kinds of things, you know, law, instructions how to operate your refrigerator, how to mend your electrical equipment, and so on and so forth. And maybe even, you know, basic news stories or, you know, but literature is something else, you know. I don't think they'll ever succeed in replacing the translator will always survive because AI can never replace the human soul, you know, and can never capture the music of language, you know. They may be able to capture certain superficial levels of meaning, yes, but no, I'm afraid I'm totally confident that the translator will survive as a species of human being. You know, we go back a very long way, translators, and I think we'll continue to be useful in terms of what cannot be done by machines, you know. I'm not afraid of machines. I'm quite happy to fight with them, you know, and to stand up for my own rights, you know. But thank you for raising that topic. Well, I'm going to ask myself a question because we do have a little bit more time, and I have something I would like to mention, which is, what do I hope to achieve with these talks, you know? And the answer is very simple. I'm hoping over the 4 talks to communicate to what is basically a young audience. It's very nice for me to come and talk to young people because, you know, I'm an old man and I spend my life living in a pretty old kind of old man's world, you know. But sometimes to see young faces, to see young people is very encouraging. And I want to try to communicate to young readers. And one of the lovely things about a Chinese city, whether it's Hong Kong, Shanghai, Chengdu, I don't mind, is that people still read books, you know. I mean, I think the book has survived in the Chinese-speaking world probably far better than it has in the English-speaking world. And I want to be able, at the end of these 4 lectures, to say to myself, as I get on my aeroplane on the Sunday, it was worthwhile because I was able to communicate a sense of the wonder of the very special quality of these stories, that they are something which stands out in the whole of Chinese literature. My very dear friend, the poet Ya-Si, I knew him for many years, and I was always saying to him, Liang Bingjun, you know, I was saying, PK, you're so fascinated by modern literature and postmodern literature and South American magical realism, but you haven't read Liao Zhai. You really ought to go and read it. And every year he would just not read them. And finally he read them about 10 years before he died. And he wrote 12 poems based on Liao Zhai's stories because he really, I was able to persuade him that he ought to read them, you know. And what I suppose in the end, why I'm giving these talks is because I've got a bit of a fire in my belly, you know. I want to persuade people that these stories are really worth reading, you know. They're hard work. They're not easy. The Chinese is very difficult. And please, I suppose, don't just read the Baihua versions, because the Baihua versions, they're almost like machine translations, you know. There are many Baihua versions. I do have them on my shelf, and occasionally I might look at them, but they don't have the magic, you know. The magic is in the words. It's in the wenyan. It's in the classical, the poetic quality of the original language, and so it's worth making an effort. It's worth working at these texts because they have, as Feng Zhenwan says, they have a lot to give. They can make you strong and brave, and they can give you something very special about the nature of human emotion, the nature of human experience. And that's really why That's why I'm giving these talks. And I guess next week I will be focusing mainly on translation. I'll be looking at some of the early translations by Herbert Giles, which I'm a great admirer of, but they had their limitations. And then I'll try and look at some of my own translations and point out I suppose, the weaknesses of my own translations and how I hope to get better at them. Okay, I think we better stop now.
Thank you, Professor Minford. Okay, and please give us your comments by scanning the QR code here. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you all in the coming last lecture. Thank you.